I am Steve.
Okay, but how much does Steve actually weigh within Minecraft? Part 1. The real world. To begin with, let's just assume some real life dimensions. So, Steve has a hitbox of 1.8 blocks by 0.6 blocks, which, given that a Minecraft block has 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter dimensions, if you were to convert it into the real world, that would lead to Steve having a height of roughly 1.8 meters, or about 6 foot. Now, Steve is a strong, healthy man. He's not overweight, nor is he particularly underweight, so we can use a BMI calculation. Assuming that he's healthy with a height of 6 foot, we get Steve's weight at around 80 kilograms. That was quick. Steve weighs 80 kilograms, mystery solved. Thanks for watching. Except, no. Steve is not actually 80 kilograms. Because Steve is an enigma of human existence. And it would actually be impossible for Steve to only weigh 80 kilograms. He's a lot more than that. For reasons that I shall now explain. Part 2. Steve's eating habits. Steve is a beast. He can scale mountains, swim through oceans, press that subscribe button, and crawl through the smallest caves. And he can sustain himself during all of that on just some raw potatoes, if he so desired. And he would be perfectly fine if he did that. However, if he had the resources to, he could instead sustain himself on notch apples. These enchanted golden apples are crafted with an apple, like obviously, and 8 blocks of solid gold. Now, if we take the weight of real world gold, and remember a block is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter in a cube, our hypothetical Minecraft gold block would weigh 19,320 kilograms. Remember, there's 8 of them per notch apple, which equates to 154,560 kilograms. And the weight of an apple is practically nothing here. So let's just say for every notch apple that Steve consumes, he gains just over 150,000 kilograms of weight. But wait, Steve has no waste products. So that weight doesn't leave him. And thus for every notch apple that he consumes, he only ever gains weight of approximately 150,000 kilograms, which is a lot. And since he could eat an infinite number of these notch apples, Steve could then hypothetically weigh infinite in terms of mass. Okay, but no, maybe you can argue that the notch apples are just special and they give Steve powers, and that maybe that weight is just lost when those effects are activated. Alright? Well, no, because even without those notch apples, Steve would still have an infinite mass, because Steve can also drink unlimited volumes of water, and again, with no waste products. This means that Steve can gather an unlimited volume of water within him, and so, given time, once again, Steve is able to achieve an infinite weight. So, there's the answer. Steve's weight is infinity. Part 3. Well, that just can't be right. There's no way that anyone could have unlimited mass. That's just not physically possible. Just like how it wouldn't be physically possible for you to not press that subscribe button. So something in our assumptions and our calculations must be wrong here. You can't be infinitely heavy, so maybe Steve isn't actually eating the food, or he does somehow have waste products. You know, it doesn't matter, whatever the explanation is, the end result is that he cannot gain the weight of all the food and the water that he consumes, and therefore he doesn't have an infinite weight. And in fact, we can even prove that he doesn't have an unlimited mass. This is because gravity exists. Now, hold on, let me explain. Sand and gravel follow the rules of gravity. So we know that gravity does exist in some fashion within the Minecraft universe, even if it is like a little bit odd. So if that's the case, then a single block wide bridge suspended over a valley should be vulnerable to structural instability if Steve walked over it and he did have this infinite mass. In fact, let's make it out of the weakest material in Minecraft, glass, and let's see what happens. Steve can walk over it just fine. and the bridge remains stable. This means that Steve must not have an infinite mass, because if he did, the glass should have shattered, which it did not. Also, the fact that Steve can jump, even when he's hungry and he can't even sprint, well, that indicates that jumping must be easy for him, even when he's on low energy. And that just wouldn't be possible if Steve had an infinite mass. And thus, with all of that evidence, we can conclude that Steve does not have infinite mass. Part 4. So, now what? Okay, cool. Steve doesn't have infinite mass, but that doesn't actually answer how heavy he really is. But luckily, there are other ways to calculate that. For instance, if we could work out Steve's density, we could then work out Steve's mass and weight. So Steve's mass will be equal to Steve's density multiplied by his volume. Now we can relatively easily work out the volume of Steve, given that we know that one block is 1 meter cubed, and each block is made up of 16 pixels, and therefore each pixel is 1/256th of a cubic meter. So let's do the maths. He's 24 pixels by 4 pixels by 8 pixels, yeah, that's the torso and legs, and 12 pixels by 4 pixels by 4 pixels, that's an arm, which Steve should have 2 of, and then 8 pixels by 8 pixels by 8 pixels, that's Steve's head, and then we can add that all together. So we end up with a grand total of around 1,664 pixels cubed, which converts to around 6.5 meters cubed. That's Steve's volume. Alright, that's a big part of the equation. So now that we have that, we just need Steve's density. And then boom, we'll have his mass. And luckily we can actually estimate Steve's density by comparing Steve, which has an unknown density, to known densities within the Minecraft world. And we can do that comparison by testing if Steve floats or sinks in things. So let's throw our good friend Steve into some mediums with known densities. First up, the air. Steve does in fact not float in the air, nor does he remain stationary. He sinks in the air, and thus Steve has a greater density than air, which is 1.225 kilograms per cubic meter. Alright, that's a good start. Second up, the water. Let's just throw him in! Now, Steve will sink instantly. Okay, that's interesting. That means that Steve also has a greater density than water, which is 998 kilograms per cubic meter. Now, notably, humans float in water. Steve doesn't. That means that Steve is therefore denser than a human being. Third, let's throw him into some lava. Or lava! Steve will also sink in this, so he won't be able to enjoy his chicken down there. But interestingly, this also means that Steve has a greater density in lava, which has a density of approximately 3,100 kilograms per cubic meter. Alright, so with those 3 tests, we can now definitively say that Steve weighs at least, let's just do some maths, 20,150 kilograms, assuming that he's denser than lava. Alright, cool, that's a good start. That's the minimum. But what's the upper bound? We're going to require a liquid that Steve actually floats in. And everything that I can think of, he just sinks in. Like, I don't know. Oh, wait, no, I just remembered. The soul sand bubble columns. When a block of soul sand is placed under solid water, the souls are released. The weight of these souls leads to the creation of bubbles that push Steve upwards and force him to float. That's it. The density of the soul water must be greater than Steve's density. And thus, we can now work out our upper bound density for Steve. And then, we'll be able to find out the truth of Steve's weight. But here's where we run into some issues. What actually is the density of soul waters? Well, souls are, I don't know, heavy, like they have the weight of death on them, so they must be pretty dense. But also souls are supernatural, and therefore are not part of this natural world, and so their density and their impact on the world are kind of uncalculatable. who's to say that their mass is like our mass? Are they some sort of dark matter, soul matter, something that we just can't understand? I don't know. This leads us to the conclusion that Steve has a density of something between 3,100 kilograms per cubic meter and soul density. Alright, so that's our range, which is kind of meaningless, as without that upper bound density limit, we can't really work out the rough mass or weight of Steve. It could literally be anything. So again, another method of mass calculation hasn't worked out, and we're no closer to figuring out how heavy Steve is. Or are we? Part 5, Redstone. Alright, there's something that we've forgotten about. Pressure plates. More specifically, weighted pressure plates. Steve can step on a light-weighted pressure plate and give off a redstone signal. Steve can then step on a heavy-weighted pressure plate and also give off a redstone signal at the same strength. But we can use the signal strength to compare the weight of Steve relative to other entities using these pressure plates. Like, we can throw gold blocks onto the same weighted pressure plate and then compare the signal between the two. Then we can balance the two signals out, and then we can discover the true weight of Steve! However, weighted pressure plates don't work like that. They only detect the number of entities, not the combined weight of said entities. So, this is kind of useless to figuring out Steve's weight. Redstone's not going to work here. Part 6. The truth. So just to recap, Steve weighs 80 kilograms, except he also has an infinite mass, but at the same time he also can't have an infinite mass. He has a density of at least 3,100 kilograms per cubic meter, which translates to 20,150 kilograms, but also has a density less than soul waters, which are unknown. Also, he can jump and he follows the rules of gravity. Yet at the same time his small stature and presumably massive weight should prevent that, especially given that he can't run when he's hungry. Yet somehow he can jump. So it's a pretty big range of potential weights, and a lot of the evidence contradicts each other. So together, bearing everything that we've learnt in mind, this could only mean one thing. That being that I have absolutely no idea what Steve's weight is. Steve is just an enigma that defies all logic, like his form shouldn't even exist, nothing about him makes sense, especially when you try to comprehend his weight. Like, I have no idea, this has all just been a massive waste of time. Or at least, on the surface it seems that way. Because there is one explanation that could tie all of these oddities together, and explain how Steve is the way he is, and give us the true value of his weight. Are you ready? Okay, I need you to hear me out here, because my conclusion is that Steve is a black hole singularity. A single point of infinite mass where the laws of physics collapse, and everything just makes no sense. Like, black holes are the most confusing part of our universe, so it only makes sense that that's what Steve is. The singularity of a black hole. And this would be supported by the infinite mass hypothetical that we discussed at the start. Just as a singularity is a single point of infinite mass, Steve is a single point of also infinite mass. That makes sense, right? And as for the disproof that we had against that, well, that would only lend itself to this theory. Black hole singularities break down all of our understandings of modern physics, just as Steve has today. And the fact that he's lifted up by the souls, well, that could just be explained by the nature of souls being supernatural and not part of this world. And thus, we can conclude that Steve is a black hole singularity. Yeah, the scientists have had it all wrong for decades. So maybe black holes aren't the terrifying cosmic entities that we're made to believe. Maybe, at the centre of every galaxy, is just Steve. Don't question it, just accept it. Steve is mass, Steve is mystery, Steve is Minecraft. Oh, and speaking of Minecraft, have you ever wondered why it looks so cinematic now? Well, check out this video. And don't worry, this one actually makes sense.